Large numbers of protesters are expected to march against Indigenous inequality. Despite public health orders, the rallies should not go ahead. Earlier, I asked Linda Burney, Shadow Minister for Indigenous Australians, whether she'll be attending any of the demonstrations.
Personally, I won't be attending any protest in the sense of going to the rallies, but my entire life and certainly the last 40 years have been about advocating the rights of First Nations people. And in particular, I've done a lot of work around the issues that people are really frustrated about now. And I think that's what's important, is that we need to understand exactly why people are frustrated, what the motivations have been, for people that will come out, not just in capital cities, Annalise, but in many regional centres as well, including Cairns and Wagga. And of course, that people stay as safe as they possibly can be in those circumstances.
So the medical advice we've heard is that there is no safe way to engage in these protests. The Chief Medical Officer, Brendan Murphy, yesterday said it could be catastrophic if anyone attended one of those protests, caught coronavirus and took it back to a remote Indigenous community. Is your advice to people to not attend in person any of these protests?
Well, the best advice I've heard was very early this morning on, I think it was ABC radio. I was listening to Coronacast. And the advice was, if you are going to attend, which of course is a decision that people will make, we urge people to look at what the legal situation is in that particular state or territory, and they vary across the country. South Australia and Western Australia are allowing the protest to go ahead legally, but to make sure that you try and keep as safe as possible. And I am sure, Annalise, there are discussions going on right now between the Sydney organisers and the New South Wales Police about what the management should be this afternoon. Labor is saying also very clearly that there are many ways that you can advocate about the issues of deaths in custody. And part of that, importantly, is dialogue that just shouldn't happen when these things flare up, but there's a dialogue that should be going along all the time.
On the point of that flare-up, this has obviously been prompted by the killing of George Floyd in the United States. Why do you think this has become such an issue for Aboriginal Australians now?
Yeah. Well, this has become an international issue. I think what's happened in America is that it's a conflagration of not just yet another death at the hands of law enforcement, but the frustration and the anger that exists in that country. It has spread across the world, and it has resonated with Aboriginal people in Australia, because we know that the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody finished 30 years ago now, Annalise, but it still very much lives in the hearts and minds of First Nations people. And there have been something like 438 Aboriginal deaths in custody since 1991. And, you know, they are real people with real families from communities that will never be the same again. And that hurt and that frustration needs to be understood. But on the same token, this has come at a time when there is a pandemic, and those health and safety issues are also incredibly important for people to listen to and to think carefully about whether they attend or whether they take their protest in some other form by way of contacting their local member of parliament, sending messages to the Prime Minister, or talking to their friends and family, talking to the Aboriginal community. The motivations are there, and I respect that and I understand that, and I share those frustrations.
Because I think that is something that people are having a hard time wrapping their heads around. It's that
Yes.
Aboriginal people have worse health outcomes. They do suffer more severely when it comes to especially respiratory issues in many cases. And so why take this risk?
Well, people are frustrated and angry. And some people are going to obviously demonstrate that by way of attending rallies across the country this afternoon. The important point to really understand, Annalise, is the point that you've just made, and that is that the social justice outcomes for First Nations people in Australia are shocking. Aboriginal people are the most incarcerated people in the world. And we've just had Reconciliation Week, and people are really furious about the actions of Rio Tinto. And Labor has been very clear in saying that we are calling on the government to introduce justice targets and targets about the statutory removal of Aboriginal children into out-of-home care in whatever the new Closing the Gap targets are. They are very real calls and genuine calls from the party that I represent.
So if you're not attending a protest in person, what will you be doing today to take part in these protests?
I'm going to be entering into some very important dialogues over the weekend. I'll continue with the work that I've done for 40 years, and that is advocating on behalf of the rights of First Nations people. And I will have very much in my heart and in my mind, as I think many millions of Australian people will have, and that is whether or not we live in a just country when it comes to the social justice outcomes for First Nations people. People need to think about that. But the other thing that I would say, Annalise, and I know that you understand this, is that Australia and the Uluru Statement has called for a national process of truth-telling, and it is through truth-telling that we will be together as a nation at some point in the future. I am sure of that.
Linda Burney, thank you for your time.
Thanks, Annalise.
New Zealanders could be enjoying zero coronavirus restrictions within a week. The Ardern government will decide on Monday whether to remove